We are going to call this meeting of the Finance Committee, February 28th, 2023, to order.
Oh, 1 second.
Oh. All right, good afternoon. This is the February 28th, 2023 meeting of the City Finance Committee, and may I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Committee Member Harmon is absent. Committee Member Gutierrez?
Here.
Committee Chair Friedman?
Here. Great. We do have a quorum, so we will go on to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to items not on today's agenda but under the purview of the Finance Committee? Start in the room. Not seeing any. Are there any online? Please raise your hand.
Chair Friedman, there are no hands raised online.
Okay, we will close general public comment and turn it over to Mr. DiMartini for the fiscal year 2023 second quarter review.
Thank you very much, Committee Chair Freeman. My name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the city's finance director. It is my pleasure to present the city's second quarter financial review for fiscal year 2023. The objective of the presentation today is to receive a report from staff on the status of revenues and expenditures in relation to the budget for the first 6 months ending December 31st of 2022, accept the fiscal year 2023 interim financial statements for the first 6 months, and then also recommend that the City Council approve of the proposed second quarter adjustments for fiscal year 2023 revenue and expenditure appropriations as detailed in the attached schedule of proposed quarter 2 adjustments. The agenda for the presentation today is to receive an update on the general fund, also receive a brief update on the city's major enterprise funds, walk through at a high level the proposed budget adjustments, and then of course answer any questions, public comment, and then discussion that the committee would like to have. So as the committee is aware, we have a process where we review the financial statements in a cadence as outlined on this slide. First, on consent in the monthly city council packets, you'll receive a monthly financial statement overview. On a quarterly basis, staff will go through a pretty detailed process where we review our revenues and expenditures and provide projection updates to you. This is our second quarter review. We're scheduled to come back to Finance Committee for the third quarter review in May, and then the fourth quarter review in September. And we typically issue the city's annual comprehensive financial statements in December of each year. This slide provides an overview of the general fund revenues on the left-hand pie chart and the right-hand pie chart being its expenditures. As you can see in our adopted budget for fiscal year 2023, actually our revised budget, that property tax makes up the lion's share, the largest proportion of our general fund revenues at $43 million or 23%. And then we get a number of revenue sources coming from sales tax, including our Measure C sales tax source, transient occupancy tax, utility user tax, so on and so forth. Other revenue is primarily made up of departmental revenues, such as permits that people are required, or parks and recreation programs and other types of services. The pie chart on the right shows how we spend our general fund dollars. A majority of our general fund dollars goes towards the public safety function of police and fire, but then also community services such as library and parks and recreation, public works, community development, so on and so forth. So now let's talk about the overview of the quarter two report. This slide here summarizes the revenues and expenditures that have come in through quarter two, again, 6 months of the year. And our revenues are coming in slightly better than the run rate of the adopted budget. And our expenditures are coming in slightly lower of the run rate of the adopted budget, which is resulting in a small surplus or savings in the current fiscal year. And you'll see that the second column from the right is showing staff's projection for the full fiscal year. At this time, staff is projecting a rather small surplus or savings of just over $3.3 million. And according to the City Council's recently adopted reserve policy, 50% of any year-end surplus or savings would go towards offsetting pension costs and liabilities, resulting in the remaining 50% staying in the general fund. So at a high level, the major trends that we're noticing thus far on the expenditure side is that we are acknowledging that there will likely be additional savings above and beyond the reduction targets that departments were implementing this current fiscal year from the continuation of many positions still being vacant. We are still realizing a rather high attrition savings rate from vacancies, from vacant positions. That's a trend that is continuing from last year and even the year prior. On the revenue side, we are continuing to see strong property tax revenues, which is great, and sales tax and TOT is still coming in strong. The growth isn't as strong as we saw in the prior year, but it is still coming in rather strong. In the projection, we are recommending a transfer of $4 million from general fund into the self-insurance fund because of the additional actuarial recommendation, which I'll talk about in detail in the coming slides. And then finally, the surplus calculation for pensions on this slide as well. So first, let's talk about revenues. Again, I mentioned that property tax is coming in strong. It has been coming in strong even throughout COVID, and so that we are planning on that continuing, and we're showing growth year over year as well. On sales tax, we're seeing increased online, auto, and restaurant spending across these industries. Inflation is also a key driver for the additional revenue. Inflation is still high. It has been high for many months. So we do benefit from that as a city from the additional sales tax revenue. Staff has been reviewing with our sales tax consultants a recession scenario, what that might look like. According to the data that we're reviewing and that we're seeing right now, there is no sign of a recession impacting our sales tax revenues at this time, but of course we are monitoring that, and we'll be talking about that in more detail in the upcoming budget cycle as well. Transient occupancy tax has returned to its pre-COVID levels, and that's primarily due to the average daily rates being record levels. It is still very high, and that's contributing to higher TOT revenue. And we're planning for that for continued growth throughout the rest of this fiscal year, likely into next fiscal year, but not at the same trajectory as we had been seeing over the past 12 months. This table right here summarizes our general fund major tax sources, showing the revised budget, the current year-to-date actuals that we have already received in revenue, and then what staff is projecting for the remainder of the fiscal year, and then compared to the actual revenues received to date from last fiscal year, so you can compare. And as you can see, our sales tax, both our regular sales and use tax and our Measure C sales tax and TOT is coming in a little bit stronger, which I've already explained and articulated. So moving on to expenditures. Again, in the adopted budget for fiscal year 23, there was a $1 million general fund expenditure reduction target. And this was resulting from a structural deficit that had really started during COVID and has since exacerbated with our ongoing revenue growth not adequate to cover our ongoing expenditure growth. We have continued cost increases in the city that you're aware of in regards to our pension and other cost of living assumption adjustments. So implementing salary savings was a strategy that staff proposed in the recommended budget that council ultimately approved of, and those have been built into the adopted budget for fiscal year 23. This slide here lists each of the general funded departments and what their departmental revised budgets are, year-to-date actual expenditures, and then what staff is projecting for their full fiscal year expenditures. A couple takeaways that I'd like the committee to be aware of on this slide is that staff is projecting that all of these departments are on target to meet all their expenditure reduction targets, which is a great thing. We're taking this seriously, and staff are projecting that. What's also illuminating on this slide is that there are savings above and beyond those expenditure reduction targets. You can see them here in the police department, parks and recreation, public works, and community development. Those departments in particular continue to have a higher vacancy rate, which is resulting in additional savings. So it's causing some delays of work getting done, but it's resulting in some savings, which helps out on expenditure savings at the end of the year. On the non-departmental line, you'll see that, yep. Okay. On the non-departmental line, you'll see that staff is projecting a full year of expenditure of just over $33 million with a negative variance of $7 million. And what's included on this line is what I talked about earlier in regards to the transfer of $4 million from the general fund into the self-insurance fund. That's recorded on this line. So now let's talk about the impact on reserves based on this current fiscal year projection. This slide here summarizes the general fund reserves. The first two lines articulate the contingency reserve target and the disaster reserve target per city council policy at 10% and 15% respectively, for a total reserve policy target of $42 million in fiscal year 2023. This slide shows that we're going to be just below policy target at around $866,000. But as you recall, the self-insurance fund is pretty significantly underfunded. And every city fund bears the burden of the self-insurance fund being underfunded. And of the underfunding of the self-insurance fund, the general fund is on the hook for approximately 50% of it. So it's important that when we talk about contingency reserves in the city's general fund, it's actually lower because the city's general fund is responsible for just over $5.7 million of the self-insurance fund being underfunded. And so really, in effect, we only have about $10 million of contingency reserves in the general fund. Now looking at our reserves in a graphical format, this graph here shows an 18-year trend of our general fund reserves. And as you can see, during the financial crisis back in 2008, the city was able to dip into these reserves to sustain its operation and to minimize any service level impacts to the community. And over the next 8 or 9 years, the city gradually built up these reserves again, which was great. And then we obviously needed to use those reserves during COVID, which we did here, showing in fiscal year 2020, and then into 2021 as well. And then we have successfully rebounded and have replenished those reserves through implementing a number of fiscal disciplinary strategies, such as controlling our costs, wherever possible, reducing our expenditures wherever possible, and implementing really strong budgeting practices to be really realistic about what we can and can't do. But there are pressures for the rest of this fiscal year and going into fiscal year 2024 and beyond. We have a structural operating deficit in the current fiscal year. As we've talked about, we've implemented expenditure reductions to minimize the impact of that deficit. We have labor MOUs, cost increases built in. We have rising pension costs. Inflation is high, which makes it more expensive to perform our daily operational work. There's still fear of a recession, although we're not really seeing signs of it at the moment, so we're not building in those assumptions at this time, but it's something we are watching very closely. And then, as I've mentioned multiple times, our self-insurance fund continues to be below its recommended level of reserve, which is, again, a burden on the general fund and other funds. So now let's move into the enterprise funds. This slide here summarizes the revenues and expenditures for 4 of our major enterprises: solid waste, water, wastewater, and downtown parking. It also shows their year-to-date actuals to date, but then also a year-end projection. And as you can see on that sort of third column from the left, solid waste and water are projecting a very small surplus at the end of the year, but wastewater and downtown parking are projecting a small deficit. And there's some challenges with the enterprises as of late in particular. With water, with water and wastewater, with the additional rainfall that we've been getting, there's a little less revenue that's being projected for water in particular. And also with a really aggressive capital improvement program, using money that has been built up over the years to implement many of the capital improvement projects is something that's coming to fruition. Downtown parking continues to have its challenges with sort of rebounding with activity levels, with parking moving towards pre-COVID levels, but not quite there yet. And they have a high degree of sort of fixed operational expenses that are hard to pivot when they're not getting the revenue that they need. And then moving on to the other 4 enterprises of clean energy, airport, golf, and waterfront, you can see that clean energy, airport, and golf are projecting to have surpluses at the end of the year as well. And I talked about a little bit the impact for some of our operating departments in regards to recent storm activity. The waterfront in particular has had to aggressively address some of the impacts to their infrastructure due to storm-related debris and other issues. And so they've had to incur additional expenditures than what were previously being projected, resulting in a projected deficit at the end of the year. This slide here summarizes the projected reserves for these 8 enterprises at the end of the year. The column on the left shows their policy reserve targets, all of them being very similar to the general fund at 10% contingency and 15% disaster. But there's also an additional reserve policy target for the enterprises that go towards their capital requirements, because many of these enterprises are very capital intensive programs. And so the column right next to it, available reserves, are the reserves that they'll have that they had at the end of the year last year, above and beyond their policy reserve target, sort of the minimum level. Again, for many of these enterprises, it's important that they build up these reserves so that they can use that cash to implement their aggressive capital improvement programs. Some of these departments are projecting to use reserves in the current fiscal year, as I showed on the prior 2 slides, resulting in available reserves, some of them going a little bit below policy target, but none of them being that substantial. Clean energy in particular is still ramping up. That enterprise has only been in existence for less than 2 years, and so they are still in the ramp-up mode, and their long-term financial plan puts them into a much better financial picture, with long-term revenues being greater than expenditures in the not so distant future. And we'll get into that in much more detail in the upcoming budget cycle. So now let's talk about the proposed budget amendments. This slide here summarizes those amendments, and again, the attachment to the report itemizes each one of these in detail. The first one and the most significant for the committee's awareness is staff's recommendation to appropriate $4 million from the general fund and transfer that money into the self-insurance fund. The city recently had an actuarial report conducted, which we do every 2 years in preparation for the 2-year budget cycle. And that actuarial report indicated that we need to be increasing the amount of resources that we have in the self-insurance fund from $18 million to $24 million. It is a very substantial increase, the largest increase that we've likely seen in the history of the self-insurance fund. The number of claims that we are projected to receive, the amount of those claims, what it costs for us to procure our property insurance, our general liability insurance, and all of our other insurance programs continues to be very expensive, and those costs are increasing. That increase of the actuarial recommended level was far above and beyond what was being projected when we prepared the current fiscal year budget. So this recommendation to transfer this cash in is to immediately address the effects of that recommended level. The other impact on the general fund for a budget adjustment that is being requested is actually a reduction of general fund for fire mutual aid, as there are far fewer events due to the recent storm activity, so there's a less mutual aid activity going on. There are other funds that are being requested for appropriation adjustments. The police department is requesting the use of available cash that they have in their equipment replacement fund, and also a small amount of Measure C money for procuring additional equipment that they need, and then also appropriating recent settlement funds that they received from an opioid settlement. And then I won't go into detail on these other ones here, but they're worth noting on the slide, and then also they're documented in more detail on the attachment. Again, talking about the self-insurance fund, this graph here shows just over a 20-year view of prior year actual self-insurance fund reserves, and then what's being projected over the next sort of 7 to 8 years. And the blue line shows what the actuary has recommended the level to be, and the red line shows what the actual reserves are in our self-insurance fund. And as you can see, back in 2011, that's where those lines started to diverge. And they were sort of holding close for a number of years, but then starting in 2016 and then really during COVID, again, is when those lines really much more significantly diverged from each other. And the Finance Committee recommended to staff just about a year ago that we implement a sort of a 9-year plan to ramp up cash going into the self-insurance fund over a 9-year period. And so this graph shows that trend continuing, sort of ramping up those reserves. But because our actuarial report is telling us that to raise the reserves by $6 million, that will likely continue as well. So we're not, unfortunately, this graph isn't showing those lines coming together, which is where we want them to go, but it's showing us making some progress. And this is still a conversation that we have to have further dialogue on, because it is an area of risk for the city that we would like to address with your direction. So to summarize, recommendations to the Finance Committee are to accept the interim financial statements for the 6 months ending December 31st, 2022. And we respectfully request that you recommend to the City Council to approve of the proposed second quarter adjustments to fiscal year 2023 revenue and expenditure appropriations as detailed in this schedule provided to you today. And with that, we'll take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the report, Mr. DiMartini. Any questions from my colleague? I have a question on if you could pull up slide 19. I just want to make sure I have it correctly. For example, when we look at the enterprise funds, and you use wastewater as the example, the available reserves in the second column from the left is 658,000, and then the projected use is 938. That 658 is above, you said it was above the requirement, the reserve policy. So that's what we have, and then so it would go into the remaining 280,000 would be taken out of that 11.1 million.
Yes, Chair Freeman, that is correct. And so staff is projecting at the end of fiscal year 2023 that the wastewater fund would need to dip into their reserve policy level of about $280,000. So they would be just below sort of the minimum requirement of the reserve level. That's correct.
And I'm just using wastewater as an example that's one of the benefits of going above the policy minimum. And this has come up at council before. The reason that we try to go above the minimum or policy requirements is that we do have heavy capital investment. So I know, if I recall, we are working on a way to try to address that in a more transparent way so that we're planning capital so it doesn't look like we build these reserves up, 10, 20, 30, 50% more than they need to be. And then the public is, well, why are you have these huge reserves? It's more for capital. So I know that that's being worked on, and I just wanted to comment on that so that in the future, when we get to a place where we're able to do that, these kind of discrepancies here, or it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to have the capital, and so we would have the reserves, but we also have capital planned for, and just make it a little easier to understand for the public. And then that's the only question I had was just on that. And so at this time, I will open up to public comment. Is there any members of the public in the room who wish to speak to this item? Not seeing any. And anybody online, please raise your hand in the app. Is there anybody in the app who wishes to speak to this item?
Chair Friedman, there are no hands raised.
All right, I will close public comment, and I'll just kick it off. Appreciate all the work that goes into this. I just want to share that when we're talking about the budget surplus or savings, I just want to reiterate this because it came up last year, is a large portion of that is because of the unfilled positions. So the expenditures are lower than we would want them to be if we had actually been able to fill those positions. And I know a lot of our staff are doing multiple tasks here, and we don't have the staffing that we would like. So that is where on the expenditure side, it's lower, so then that helps create the surplus, but it's only a surplus because we haven't been able to get the staffing that we want. So we are trying to address that. It's not just us, it's municipalities and the private sector all over the country are dealing with this issue. So it's more of a savings, it's not necessarily a surplus because of the fact that the expenditures are lower. And if you had accounted, if we were staffed like we wanted to be, and then if you account for that and including the record TOT, we would actually be very close to balancing even with record TOT. And I think it's important that the public understands that if we were properly staffed, we would be basically right where we need to be, and we wouldn't have a surplus even with those higher than expected returns on TOT and sales tax. And then in terms of, I am supporting the insurance into the self-insurance fund. Our costs are going up on the insurance, the claims are out there going up, and the general fund is the backup, and there's a lot of general fund pressures on there, and to not properly plan now puts even more additional pressures onto the general fund if we didn't do that. And the actuarial, unfortunately, I mean, it's the largest jump. You said it's the hard. In my 5 years here, I haven't seen it go up that much, so we do need to plan for that, so I think it's appropriate use. And it's in line with the 9-year plan that the council has adopted. So I'm supportive of the staff recommendations. And do you have any comments?
I just want to thank the finance director and the staff that's been supporting with this report. We are facing difficult times, and I really, really appreciate all the time and effort and the clarity of these presentations for the public. So thank you, and I will be supporting staff recommendation as well.
Is that a motion?
Yes, it is.
And I will second it. So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye for the staff recommendation. None opposed. And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.